Hello and good morning to our viewers in the United States and the audience joining us from around the world. I'm Reed Blakemore, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation on Europe's carbon capture and storage strategy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has roiled energy markets, sending all forms of energy prices higher, with regional energy prices reaching eye-watering levels. Yet at the same time, combating climate change is more urgent than ever, and achieving Europe's climate goals while balancing affordability and supply security will be incredibly challenging. Carbon capture and storage, or CCS, clearly has a role to play here, and to this end, the field is increasingly dynamic. The European Commission just proposed a Europe-wide voluntary framework to reliably certify high-quality carbon removals, and this further advances the question: what are the next steps for CCUS in Europe's decarbonization efforts, and overall, what is Europe's CCS strategy? To answer these questions, we have an all-star lineup for you this morning, including Ms. Tatiana Marquez Uriarte, a member of the cabinet of the Commissioner for Energy, Kadri Simpson, at the European Commission. Her responsibilities include energy system integration, gas internal market and security of supply, hydrogen strategy, as well as carbon capture, storage, and energy-intensive industry. We also have Mr. Malte Bornkamp, head of the Division of Industrial Decarbonization Market Framework and International Cooperation. Malte has been working at the nexus of climate and industrial policy for more than 20 years, and so offers a wealth of experience in how to navigate these various issues for Europe. We have Dr. Justus Andreas, the team leader at Bologna Deutschland in Berlin. He initially joined the Brussels office of Bologna in November 2017, and his work focuses on the decarbonization of industry and associated climate technologies. He also holds a PhD in environmental economics and environmental management from the University of York. And then finally, we have Mr. Ebhard Pernot, Policy Manager for Carbon Capture at the Clean Air Task Force, where he supports the carbon capture team in developing and implementing policies to support carbon capture policy and storage technologies throughout the European Union. I'd also like to thank Ebhard and CATF for their support in advancing this particular discussion we're having today. Before we begin, a few housekeeping points. This conversation is public and on the record, streaming live over Zoom, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, with a recording available across all these platforms afterwards. For those of you on Twitter, we hope you can follow along with the conversation using the hashtag ACEnergy. And if you're joining us over Zoom, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature on the app. I'll be doing my best to get to these later on in the discussion today. And unfortunately, if you're using a different platform like YouTube or Twitter, we won't be able to take your questions. So that's just a reason to register and get the Zoom link next time. Now, I'd like to start off with each of our panelists with an initial broad question. And Tatiana, I think I might want to start with you. What role does CCS play in reaching Europe's carbon management goals?
Hello, good morning to everyone in the US. Good afternoon to those in Europe. For the European Commission, the role that carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and use is going to play in the next decades is going to be essential to achieve decarbonization of the EU economy. This is our objective for 2050, and for which we also have ambitious objectives, ambitious targets for 2030. Indeed, in our modeling, we have calculated that we will need to capture around between 300 and 640 million tons of CO2 a year by 2050 in order to meet our climate objectives. So basically limit climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We also see it as an absolute essential technology for decarbonization of what we call the hard to abate sector. So those ones that still use natural gas and which have difficulties in electrifying themselves. So we basically have only two solutions for these sectors. One is to move into hydrogen. Second one is to move into carbon capture and storage. This is why for us, it's an essential policy on which the Directorate General of Energy in the Commission is working very hard in basically three main areas. So on the one hand, to make sure that the projects that we are having currently are enough, and that they will continue growing over time, and they have enough financing, enough funds to see the light. For that, we have already European funds in place. The Horizon Europe Fund for Research and Innovation, which is the largest research and innovation fund in the world. We have also an innovation fund, which is specific to decarbonization technologies, and where we just launched in the month of November a new tender for new core proposals of projects which go as far as 3 billion euros that will be dedicated to decarbonization technologies and carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and use among them. And this is what it has allowed that currently, in the previous two calls that we had, which amounted to 2.5 billion euros, we managed to single out 11 carbon capture and storage projects that are currently ongoing. 11, which represent a very big, significant number of the 24 projects that were selected. So, as I said, carbon capture and storage is an essential technology from the decarbonization point of view for Europe and the European Commission. The two other areas where we are working are basically infrastructure. So kind of trying to end the chicken and egg problem that we have with carbon capture and storage, that some people in the industry are telling us we do not have enough projects because we do not know what to do with the CO2 that we capture. We need to have the infrastructure to transport it and storage. And those who said, well, we don't have that infrastructure because there are not enough projects. So we try to address that problem by notably making sure that there will be CO2 transport and storage infrastructures in Europe. Now you can label CO2 transport and storage infrastructures as projects of common interest, which in the EU jargon means that you have a number of facilities as a project. So you will have a one-stop shop for all the authorizations. You will have access to potential financing under the Connecting Europe facility, where we have already 6 transport and storage CCS projects already functioning in the process of being built. And you, of course, have the political support of the Commission behind you. And we are working more broadly to see whether we also need to regulate in the future these CO2 infrastructures. So whether we need to look into things like third-party access, ownership, who can access those infrastructure, who will finance those infrastructures. So these are the type of things that keep busy the Directorate General of Energy. And thirdly, we also work on regulation because we know that it will not be enough to capture the CO2 from the industry. We will also, in order to meet our decarbonization objectives, have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And this is why we just made a proposal on a certification system for carbon removals. But I think it will also help the industry to have certainty about, how to certify that what they are doing is in line with sustainability criteria, and they can also in the future also trade these certificates and create a new source of revenues for the industry. That is from me. I hope I was not too long.
I don't think you were too long at all. That was a fantastic overview of where we're at. And I think I might turn to Mr. Malte-Bornkamp next, just to respond to your thoughts on the outlook for the EU's CCS strategy. Mr. Bornkamp, what is your kind of outlook here? What is the role for CCUS in Europe? And in particular, how can it help navigate this nexus between security of supply and the urgent need to decarbonize?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me here, and good morning to the United States and to all the listeners. Well, I will comment from a German perspective, of course, so I will not be able to comment on the whole European strategy. But I'd like to emphasize first that even given the energy crisis, of course, our focus at the moment is how to replace fossil energy sources from Russia, and to really get over this crisis well, also support Ukraine in these efforts. But at the same time, of course, we're still pursuing the long-term goals of decarbonization and of the climate neutrality targets, which is 2045 climate neutral for Germany, so 5 years ahead of Europe. So on the one hand, with regard to the objectives, we're 5 years ahead, let's say, and but on the other hand, as you may know, the topic of CCUS in Germany, it's quite controversial, and it's a long debate. So we're looking now what CCUS, what growth can have in the framework of decarbonization, and I think there are like several building blocks that we need. Point out 5. So one is the European legal framework. I will not go to detail, but many things have mentioned. We need a EU emission trading system, regulation on recognition of CCU, for example, and how far it will be recognized. And the sustainable carbon cycles have been mentioned. The certification system proposed by the Commission, and also the CCS directive. So this is important building block for our work. And what we're doing at this stage is drafting evaluation report on the CCS Act in Germany, which currently only allows for research projects in the field of CCS. So what we had to do, what we're doing was like assess the progress made in technologies and projects on CCU and CCS in a global European context, and try to apply it, how it could help us in the German, especially in the industrial decarbonization strategy. So and the chicken egg problem has been mentioned. There's a further one as far as it's concerned in our situation. It's a legal framework which still has to be clarified in Germany. So we have an act, but as I said, it doesn't allow for a commercial project at this stage, but we're looking at this. So based on the evaluation, we will intend to draft a carbon management strategy where on the political level, the decisions will be made and how far the technology may be used and can be used for especially identify industrial processes, maybe also waste streams as CO2 sources, and identify transport and infrastructure needs. And of course, also available storage capacities. Of course, you also have to see what is capacity, what volume, and where would be possible. I think it's clear that strong inter-European but also international cooperation will be necessary to implement such a new technology. It's clear London Protocol, we have to look at the ratification there, and also the bilateral cooperation with other countries which would be maybe host storage sites. One final remarks on funding. It's been mentioned by the European Commission, of course. We also support this developments on the European level there, and also have national funding instruments, several billion euros, not specifically for CCUS, but they are also entitled to apply. So this is the Industrial Decarbonization Fund, and also the Climate Complex Difference, where we currently developing the guidelines. Yeah, this is basically state of play in Germany, and of course we're very well, we're following the European discussions here, and we'll try to feed into a European process. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Malte. I think that's another. I mean, we've now had the European process, and specifically the German context under which we're seeing CCUS developments take place over the past just several weeks. In fact, if we're looking just back to November, I might turn to you next, Justus. From Bologna's perspective, from your perspective, how have you seen the CCUS space evolve in response to the current crisis in Europe and the urgency to decarbonize?
Thank you, and thank you also for the invitation to be here today. It's a great pleasure. I guess maybe a word about Bellona. We are an international environmental and climate organization with offices across Europe. So our focus is also very much on Europe, and we've been working primarily on industrial decarbonization and climate action industry for many years. So CCS has always been on our radar in that respect, as Ms. Marquez already kind of showed that hard-to-abate sectors are primarily in the industry, and this is where CCS, I think, has its critical role to play. At the same time, I think it's really important to keep both CCS and CDR very separate. We see CCS as a mitigation technology that we really want to put on emission point sources that struggle to decarbonize in another way and in a timely fashion, whereas CDR is, a negative emissions option that really has to be separate, because we don't want to end up in a big offsetting game where we're actually not doing what we can at the emission sources. So having said that, I think one thing that is really critical is to really understand the pace and scale at which we have to move in Europe, and the crisis now with the natural gas bridge that we've seen in many kind of sectors falling away, I think really showed what is important if we really want to have a resilient strategy and a resilient plan on how we can do this and enable industry also to act as quickly as possible. And that goes through a variety of infrastructures that we need to provide to really show the optionality also to industries to decide and have a way forward. I think the good old chicken and egg problem that we've identified is has become a lot more critical right now, because the move towards hydrogen, for example, in the steel sector, has been largely based on gas for a medium term, basically either directly or through blue hydrogen. Now there's questions around commerciality, and that's of course a big question mark also for industries such as the steel industry that finds itself in global competition. So overall, I think what we really need is pace, scale, and commerciality when we're talking about climate action industry. And in terms of scale, we have, I think, we are in a very difficult position in Europe because we lack the potentials around renewable generation and therefore the electrification pathway, either directly or indirectly, that other regions such as North America are a lot more blessed with. And then if we add the pace dimension to it as well, and we want to adhere as close as possible to the 1.5 target, we really can't wait for that time, and when we actually have the renewable electricity build out to such a degree and the international trade for hydrogen to such a degree in also a commercial way, in a cheap and efficient way that allows industry to remain in Europe. And that, I think, is then the critical role for CCS as a bridge until we've actually managed to create those new market and those new feedstocks and resources. Because one thing is clear, hydrogen has a role to play, but unlike natural gas, it is not an energy source, but a carrier. And therefore, behind it all stands vast amounts of renewable electricity. And if we look at actually the challenges that we still have for direct electrification, there is this kind of bottleneck that we need to deal with for the next 10, 15 years, and probably even beyond, because it's just an immense scale of electric requirements that we have in the primary energy provision. So CCS in this, I think, is critical because it can allow those industrial sectors to already have an option available that they can hook in, that they can show that they can actually be part of a Paris compliant future industrial sector. And this, I think, is absolutely critical if we want to move the benchmark of what is possible to where we need to be. I'm not saying that every industry, therefore, should be doing CCS in 2030, but if we actually say that CCS is on the table, we can do this. That means that we also have CCS in terms of an innovator in a way, where other industries also have to say, we can't just hide behind high energy prices anymore. There is options available. We also can go a different path now we can decide what we want to do, but it changes the narrative. And I think that is absolutely critical from a climate perspective, that we really get out of the planning stage and the scenario stage where we build different pathways and adjust them every year over again based on the external factors, but we really get into the implementation stage. And that isn't little pilot projects here and there, but that is really scaling up that action, getting those first industrial scale processes out there that can showcase this is possible, and CCS is a great enabler in that respect, but also not forgetting all the other levers that we need to pull for industrial decarbonization, material efficiency, sufficiency, as well as, of course, building out renewables, building out grids, getting that electrification underway. But if we really want to be resilient, all those different aspects have to go together, and CCS is really a central piece to that puzzle.
I want to give Ebert a chance to weigh in here. And, while all three of our panelists now have mentioned the chicken and egg problem, I think it might be unfair to ask Ebert to solve that chicken and egg problem. But I would wonder from, being that CATF has been observing these developments in the CCS space in Europe for so long now, from your perspective, what are the policy gaps that we need to think through to, as just mentioned, kind of resolve that chicken and egg problem, get to commercial scale deployment. And I think, to bring up something that Tatiana said, go through the de-risking in a way needed to realize, the scale of CCS deployment that we need to, let it be an effective tool in the decarbonization toolbox per se.
It's Reid. I'm not going to solve the chicken and egg problem, but I'm going to give it a go. So good morning, everyone in the United States. Good afternoon. My name is Ebert. I'm policy manager for carbon capture at CATF. Clean Air Task Force, just to give a bit of background, is an international climate NGO. We're originally based in the United States, but we're active now in several continents, including in Europe, where we've been for over 2 years, focusing on various different aspects of decarbonization, very much looking at things from a system perspective, and carbon capture is an incredibly important part of getting to a global energy system that's net zero compatible. So I think when we're looking at policy, I think very much lessons from the United States, especially in recent months, are ones where we could take a great example from. There's a lot of discussions on this week, in particular regarding the Inflation Reduction Act and how Europe should respond, or how can Europe respond. And I think one critical important part of the Inflation Reduction Act that we need to consider is the fact that it's actually a plethora of various different options to decarbonize. There's a lot of supports there for electric vehicles, for wind and solar, but also what it recognizes that, that carbon capture and storage is a critical component of that, of decarbonization, that it is very much a climate technology. And while, European policymakers are very concerned, and rightly so, about how this might lead to long-term impacts on Europe's industrial sector, I think it's very important that we try and take stock of sort of where we are in the middle of an energy crisis, and actually it may also be a sort of a potential for opportunity really for Europe here to assess that strategy on looking at overall energy policy was hinged very much on the reliance on a single source of energy coming from one particular region, and that was namely Russian gas. And I think what was inherent in the problem was that we've also been very much focused on climate as a similar strategy, that we will only get there relying entirely on wind and solar. And I think what now is sort of a different strategy is needed overall is one that very much looks at the various options that we have on the table and trying to exercise all of them as they're needed. And this includes looking at carbon capture. And I think that's something that we have a great opportunity actually in Europe. We know that we have difficulties and will have difficulties in reaching the various different targets we have set for renewable energy, for green hydrogen, and that we are going to continue to import a lot of our energy, and that we need to make sure that those imports are as clean as possible. But Europe also does have a lot of opportunity here. I mean, we do have considerable technical know-how, we have large resources and access to financial capital, and what's really important as well is we do have a population that's very much climate focused and wants to decarbonize our economy as quickly as possible. And I think we should always recognize that. In particular, I think there's been a lot of issues regarding sort of how the public will respond to carbon capture. I think from policymakers have rightly sort of exercised concerns about, how the environmental movement perceives carbon capture and storage. And I think very much, what we want to see now, just as Justus mentioned, that we're moving from a planning stage, that we need to sort of ramp up action and see getting projects, getting steel in the ground. that the environmental movement is also involved in this process, that we have sort of, that we facilitate or that policymakers continue to allow and also expand our role as worthwhile stakeholders in this process that isn't just an industry-led operation. And this also extends to sort of how we're looking at policy instruments to accelerate this. And I think in Germany, for example, we've seen this week an announcement from the scheme focused on decarbonizing the industrial sector through carbon contracts for difference. I think another advantage to Europe's sort of focus on our strategy to decarbonize its economy is the fact that we have an emissions trading system. We have a carbon price. That is what the United States doesn't have. And I think what policymakers now are recognizing in European member states, and in particular in Germany, is that working with this emissions trading system price and this ETS price, that we can actually facilitate large-scale decarbonization of the economy without actually having to hand out incredible amounts of sums of subsidies that the United States might have had to do, and that actually might be able to do it more efficiently and faster than the United States can. And so I'm looking at policies like carbon contracts for difference, I think, is also working with other member states to try and facilitate cross-border infrastructure as much as possible is very much what's needed. And I think what we recognize in particular from Germany and sort of the focus now on building a carbon management strategy, as well as sort of coming from the European level and having a carbon capture and storage communication next year, this recognizing the political ambition as well as the sort of policies, and that's something that we're very pleased to see.
Mm-hmm. I think, Everard, I'm glad you brought up the Inflation Reduction Act, because I think it's an interesting twist here. And I might turn to Tatiana for your thoughts. I think, Everard, you pulled out, there are differences in terms of the approach taken in the Inflation Reduction Act versus the opportunities that Europe can pursue to advance its own CCUS goal. How has the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act changed the debate, or at least the policy conversation around CCUS and scaling CCUS at the European level?
A second. Yeah, well, I mean, obviously it has been, it is a debate that has emerged very, very strongly from many actors in the decarbonization industry, not just the carbon capture and storage, but also the hydrogen and renewable operators in general, who obviously would like that the EU matches to some extent the amount of funds that are being put on the table by the US to achieve decarbonization. I nevertheless think that on the one hand, we have already very important funds at EU level to basically bridge the gap between the cost of these decarbonization technologies and the cost of gas in particular, or the cost of polluting. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't need private funds. That doesn't mean that it's enough. We know that there are many difficulties, but the EU has been putting money on the table for many, many years already, many programs. And I think that in a way, there should not be competition between the countries regarding who basically attracts more investors in one technology. I think we all need to make efforts in particular in developing countries to make sure that these technologies they scale up as soon as possible, because the global objective for all of us is to basically stop climate change. And whether that happens in the EU or in the US, I would say it has to happen everywhere. It has to happen everywhere. So, of course, there is an underlying debate concerning the industry, the technological, who will be the pioneer in one or another technology. That's an industrial policy debate. From the decarbonization objective, I think that we should be happy that all countries, or US in particular, are making such a big bet for decarbonization technologies. Another thing is obviously whether how do you design this in order to avoid basically competition issues, problems of subsidies, that could be caught under WTO rules and so on. And this is a fair point. My colleagues in the Director General of Trade are obviously looking at this very closely, but I think that the debate is somehow not there. From the decarbonization perspective, it's always positive, and we work very well with the US within the US Clean Energy Forum to basically move ahead in all these technologies, transfer experience, exchange on all this, and in particular, carbon capture and storage is probably one of these fields where both the US and the EU are very interested, and we work together very well.
Malta, I'd like to give you the opportunity to weigh in here, particularly when we're talking about this nexus between, industrial policy, right, but also the need to support, the commercial scale development of CCUS, and in particular, I think, when you look to those commercial scales, I wonder if you might also have a comment on kind of the role of blue hydrogen, right, in this, in this intersection, which appears to be, a major possible, product demand source, whatever you want to call it, when you look at the broader implementation of CCUS strategies.
Yes, well, I'm not an expert of the US strategy, because of course we have took note of the IRA and analyzing it and comparing it to European approaches. I think what's important is that each country, each region has their own strategy how to decarbonize industry. So we see the American approach with this new big package on the table, and I think the European strategy is kind of look at different angles, different instruments. Once we mentioned the emission trading system, putting carbon price, so partially putting the transformation, pushing it. And then, of course, as I said, we also have funding mechanisms. We were looking into green lead markets. So that's why we speak of a market framework. So we have to enable investors to produce competitively, also for new green technologies. And of course, it's good if different regions of the world go ahead here, and especially the G7 probably should lead this development, since they're the ones which are best positioned to do it. And that's why under the German presidency, we also put an emphasis on industrial decarbonization here, and cooperated in the industrial decarbonization agenda, and proposed cooperation on these issues. And also we were proposing, the German government proposed forming a climate club, which is like not there to exclude anyone, but rather to focus together on the challenge. Well, two things we have to separate, of course. If you have a different strategy, the one thing is the climate ambition effect, let's say, that of course you can also have be very ambitious with a lot of carrots measures, or not sticks, so pull measures. But the other things, of course, a level playing field, and the carbon leakage issue. So if we put more pressure on industry, if we in a way to do with the carbon price, this of course has to be balanced in the policy. And different, well, we're looking at hydrogen. We're looking primarily at green hydrogen here, so we're looking at the hydrogen question. Of course, for us, it's very important that it's clean hydrogen, and that we it's really hydrogen that supports the transition, and so that we really decarbonize also not only scope 1 but also scope 2 and 3 emissions here.
You mentioned, well, before I ask this next question, I want to remind our audience that they can submit questions through the Q&A function on their Zoom screen. But Malta, I might turn back to you once more quickly. You mentioned the development of market frameworks as a key piece of that. In my mind, one of the issues there really is, the possibility for cross-border CO2 networks. And of course, for Germany in particular, we've seen some interest from Norway and elsewhere, right, in off-taking that CO2 across the border for disposal purposes. in your mind, I'd be interested to hear, what are the opportunities and risks for cross-border CO2 networks with an eye to, continuing to develop and mature the broader market frameworks that can help with commercial scaling?
Well, we are on the initial stage of analyzing like all the facts of cross-border cooperation here. As you may know, my ministry has been in Oslo and also not only emphasize cooperation on LNG and hydrogen, but also potentially in the sphere of CCUS. Well, if you cooperate, it's you have different challenges here. One's infrastructure, so there must be a business case. But first of all, you need the legal framework, and that's actually where we are looking at the stage. In the moment, it's not even possible legally to build an infrastructure. And also, as I said, we need the European framework here. So the market incentives, ETS, but also for negative emissions and certification. And all this has to be put together in the end if we want to succeed in this.
I think, I might pulling on a thread that I think has been consistent here throughout our discussion, both in regards to cross-border networks as well as the balancing between the United States and Europe and their respective approaches to deploying CCUS at scale. There is a transatlantic partnership element, right, that appears to be at play. And so, just to end, Everett, I might ask you to both weigh in on this question separately, which is, in what ways can the United States and Europe, and possibly, Canada as well, cooperate on CCUS in ways that we aren't already seeing? Is there opportunity for additional cooperation and partnership here that we're not seizing and should really be looking to in the next year? Let's start with Justus, and then we'll go to Everett.
Yeah, I'm sure Evert can speak a lot more to the US lessons, but I think generally the US is well ahead in the experience of actually deploying carbon capture and storage technologies. At the same time, we have in Europe, as well as in the US, a range of similar companies that struggle with similar challenges. So I think the kind of lessons that we can learn, how to both incentivize, how to operate, and what also the kind of the technical requirements are absolutely there. We have companies that like the Linde AG, which is one of the key players in North America, who is also a key player in Europe and is kind of a leader in the transport of CO2. These are, I think, these are know-hows that we can definitely align more on. So I think on a technical aspect, we can have both best practices as well as lessons that might not have worked out so well in North America and certain other projects. But I think generally what you were saying earlier about the cross-border infrastructure, I think this is absolutely critical even within Europe. Just something, I guess, as Mr. Bornkamm said, there is a strategic industry strategies for every country. We have the wider European framework of the 10E, the 10T, as well as the PCIs. I think this is all well and fantastic, but what we really need is also governments to make those plans jointly. And this isn't just with Norway and those guys who really want to store the CO2, but this is also from a German perspective to think system-wise across those different aspects that we need to decarbonize with the view of what neighbors are doing. We are not doing this in isolation. We have industrial value chains that actually cross borders frequently between Germany, Poland, Czechia, Austria, basically everyone around us, as well as all the way to the Iberian Peninsula, ensuring that we really connect all infrastructure projects from grids to also CCS is absolutely critical. And I think this is something that might be a little bit easier in the US, which is actually a federation, and you have kind of a central planning framework on how you can really utilize the different benefits of the sun in Texas and the wind and the coastal areas. But this is something I think that in Europe, we really have to get better in, both at a European level to have a better energy union, which was a big thing years ago and somehow subsided into a little bit into the back chamber. but also if and when someone is planning in a ministry how to actually engage and how to tackle these really complex infrastructural projects, to directly seek the contact of the mirroring ministry in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Poland, because one thing is clear. The pressures are high for everyone, which means that everyone is currently facing the same challenges. There is no one who's well ahead and no one who's lagging behind. I think everyone is struggling with very similar challenges, and getting a joint momentum around this is critical. And the lessons that we can learn from how Canada and the US are interacting, working together in this, and how the US itself has kind of boosted these infrastructures. I don't know how many thousands of kilometers of CO2 pipeline you guys are currently building, but I wish we had even 8,000 kilometer pipeline currently being put into the ground just to get things going.
Thanks. Yeah, just to add, so there's three key problems, I think, with regard to carbon capture, and I think broader with decarbonization. These are sort of three broad themes, but they're namely money, infrastructure, and people. And I think that there's very interesting ways in which the United States and Europe can cooperate on this, and I think in sort of two different frames. So I'm going to try and address those individually. The first thing is money, right? So last year there was, according to Bloomberg NEF, there was about $750 billion was spent on clean technologies globally. Carbon capture and storage received $2 billion of that. So I think there's a lot of scope in ways in which the United States and Europe can make clear that actually more funding definitely needed for one of the most overlooked and underappreciated climate technologies. Infrastructure is a huge problem. Like Justus mentioned, the United States has some CO2 pipelines, has also considerable experience in doing carbon capture and storage projects. Europe has maybe a slightly less experience, but also there's ways in which Europe can help facilitate the United States, namely offshore storage, for example, is something that's been done in Norway for the last 25 years. In the United States, it hasn't been done so. And I think the United States has also been sort of a leader in onshore storage, whereas Europe has not done that at all. So I think there's ways in which we can facilitate both sides of the Atlantic in terms of their learnings on this, and also making these projects better, right? I think a lot of the carbon capture and storage projects used for enhanced oil recovery, there's a lot of other projects that have not worked so well thus far, and that's largely due to the fact that a proper policy framework is not in place to actually make them work well, that there was an clear economic incentive there or requirement to make CO2 storage projects function operational in a very positive way. And this is something that we've already seen in Norway, where they've been doing it for 25 years, that when there was a proper legal framework and a policy framework in place to make carbon capture and storage work well, that it did work well. And I think that's something that the United States and Europe can make sure as well with these new projects coming along, that they function really well. And I think the third point is perhaps even more overlooked is the people aspect, right? So I think one of the key issues we see is there's just simply not enough people in space. I think one of the advantages that Europe and the United States has is access to universities, to research institutions. And I suppose this is more of a broader focus as well, is that, decarbonizing Europe and decarbonizing the United States is the end goal here, that we very much have to have a global focus in mind. And I think this is where the cooperation can't just remain sort of between both sides of the Atlantic, but we very much need to be seen as leading lights on this. And I think that this is where it becomes important looking at other regions in Africa, Asia, South America, for example, where there's a lack of access to those two other things as well, to infrastructure, as well as to funding and financing, but also talent and people who've been sort of experienced, who know about carbon capture and storage, who have an education and background and expertise in this, that we can very much sort of be part of the process and sort of in sort of accelerating the deployment of carbon capture and storage worldwide. And I think that that's sort of the way in which we need to focus, is around these sort of three key problem areas for CCS at the moment.
Tatiana, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on this idea of, pathways forward for CCS within the context of transatlantic cooperation. How can we see that cooperation, add value to what the EU and the United States and Canada, for that matter, are trying to accomplish in this space?
I just wanted to add to what it has already been said, because I fully agree that certainly those cross-border agreements on infrastructure and that type of cooperation, both technology and on infrastructure with the US, would be essential. But beyond that, I think that there is a key building block that is still not sufficiently taken care of, at least in Europe, which is bringing the industry, this hard-to-abate industry, into the carbon and capture technology world, if you wish. There are many European companies and American companies that work at the two sides of the Atlantic, and they could basically use the same type of technological solutions that they are using at one side of it to also being reproduced at the other side of the ocean. And of course, having something kind of same type of strategies of decarbonization independently of where they are. I mean, and I think that from that perspective, the EU and the US would be very happy in facilitating that they make this step, and they look at carbon capture and storage as a solution to achieve decarbonization of the processes. In the EU, we have created just very recently an alliance of carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and use stakeholders. So trying to bring together people of the providing the technology with people dealing with the transport, with storage, but also more and more this CO2 emitters, and also, of course, CO2 users, so people who might be interested in buying the CO2. So I think it's important that we do not cooperate only between member states, but also at company level.
That all ties back then to this question of commercialization, which I might use, as a segue to the question we have in the chat currently, which Malta, I'm going to kick your way. When we talk about commercialization and the support that member states can provide companies in terms of deploying CCS and associated infrastructure. The question in the chat specifically asks, does the new contracts for difference scheme in Germany provide or include support for blue hydrogen? And I guess if it doesn't, is support for blue hydrogen kind of thought about as a possible area where those type of schemes can be supportive of supporting commercialization in the space?
Yes, the guidelines are still under development, so I can't really comment on specificities. I think but there's a version out there, and if it will be allowed, it will depend also on the carbon footprint issues. So we, as I said, it's very important, scope 1, 2, and 3, so that you really produce it climate friendly. But as I said, it's something that's still under consideration, and the version is already out there and open for comment. Well, more generally speaking, of course, we have to make sure to have enough resources of green hydrogen, and that green hydrogen will be prioritized in our strategy.
No, that's fair. And I think, we're quickly approaching the end of our time here, but I really want to take a moment quickly with our last few minutes to ask, we've the one item that we haven't really mentioned yet here is this concept of additionality. And while that could probably warrant its own hour-long discussion, it was given a reference in the most recent EU proposal. And so, Tatiana, I wonder if you would be willing to possibly touch on, how is the EU currently, how are you thinking about additionality in a CCS context? How does that play in here, given the need to add value to the space?
Well, you are right. In the carbon removal proposal that the Commission made very recently, we look into several principles, right? One of them being additionality, another one obviously being sustainability. So making sure that the way that you capture and you store the CO2 meets some sustainability criteria, and is also compatible with other sustainable objectives beyond climate change, like for instance biodiversity. Additionality is important because basically we need to ensure that when we deliver a certificate, we for someone who has captured the CO2, this is not something that was going to happen in any case. So it should be CO2 emissions that are additionally captured that otherwise would have gone to the atmosphere. And it's very important for us basically to make sure that we are giving the right incentives to people to change their behavior, to make an additional effort, and to put the technology into place. So we want to kind of avoid any kind of suspicion of greenwashing of the technology, because I think the credibility of the technology also goes with it. So it's very important that together with the sustainability conditions, we also pay attention that the CO2 emissions are real CO2 emissions that have been avoided.
Just actually, I might turn to you just as kind of we begin our close here and we look to kind of the outlook for CCUS moving forward. One of the items that has been mentioned a couple of times is the need to advance CCUS through some really creative policy mechanisms, but at the same time, set up some really strong safeguards to avoid greenwashing. How do we effectively walk that line moving forward while still giving CCUS the support it needs?
Well, I'm not going to go through the catalog, I think, of things that we need to do here, because that would definitely go beyond the 5 minutes. But I think what we really have to do is provide, take serious the concerns that exist around both CCS applications directly at an emitting industry as well as in the blue hydrogen value chain. Absolutely ensuring that all scope emissions are included, that we're using CCS at its most efficient and effective and targeted. I think those are regulatory requirements that might differ also from each country to another. But this, I think, really requires a participatory process of those stakeholders where we can sit together and evaluate the concerns as well as the needs and find a balancing act. So this doesn't now sound as something that can happen fast, but I think it's something that's absolutely necessary. Ideally, we've had this already 5 years ago. We would be in a different position, but I think what-if games aren't really helpful at this point. So I think right now we really need to get cracking and get those conversations going, particularly in countries such as Germany, where we still have, I think, a bit of homework to do and truly understanding where everyone is standing and what the needs are and what is actually possible and feasible and what can be carried also by society in this respect. And otherwise, I fully agree with what Mr. Bornkamp said earlier. I think there's multiple levers that we need in terms of commercialization and driving this forward. Parts can be done through the CCFDs by actually giving that investment security to those actors. But also, I think lead markets have an absolutely critical role to play here to really drive products to the market, to also showcase to maybe actors that might be ignored by those initial CCFDs, to show there is a market operating. I can already reduce my emissions in a transformative way to gain access to that market, and I might already be breaking even or maybe even running a profit. I think these simultaneous push and pull mechanisms are really, really valuable. And to go back to the question from earlier, I think this is something that we can also learn from the US. I think big buyers initiatives utilizing the procurement power of major entities, whether these are public or private, the Googles and Microsoft that I think have done a tremendous job, for example, in the construction material sector. In the US, I think those are fantastic examples of how major procurers can actually drive innovation and ambition in industry. What, of course, currently we have is the big infrastructure problem. And I think this is something that that falls firmly into the hands and the remit of governments, because as Ms. Marquez earlier mentioned, crucially, we want this to be open access. We don't want to create new monopolies. We want to create this in a way that really allows also smaller entities as well as dispersed sites to find a way to actually access this, to have a path towards decarbonization. This goes both for hydrogen and CO2 as well as electrification. I don't want to open that box and what all needs to be done for us to actually encourage proper electrification. Price is, of course, crucial. So there needs to be a new electricity market design, but I'm not going to go there. So the point is, I think the regulatory framework around those infrastructures is crucial. What we really don't want to see is that CCS becomes just the new cash cow for the oil and gas industry. I'm not sure whether we need to take it all the way away from oil and gas, because there is an expertise there that we want to utilize. But I think government has a critical role to play here, together also with key actors such as civil society, to develop the framework that we ensure open access, a fair, democratic, transparent system in place, where we have good monitoring results as well, and that we adhere also to the very clear outlined environmental requirements that we have through the CO2 storage directive and through also the German KSPG, that those are adhered to the letter, and that the government is basically in charge of this entire affair, and we ensure that CCS really fulfills its potential as a scalable and significant contributor to climate mitigation.
I want to give all our panelists the opportunity to ask some closing thoughts. And so, Malte, I might turn to you next. You just mentioned, Germany has a little bit of homework to do. What are the key pieces that you're hoping will fall in place, let's say over the next year, in Germany's CCUS deployment story? Obviously, understanding that we are balancing at the moment the urgency of displacing Russian gas from the system at large. And so there's both security of supply and decarbonization challenges that we're navigating in tandem.
Well, as I said, I think the main challenges for the carbon management strategy for us will be, one, identify the CO2 sources where we can apply this technology, infrastructure needs, and also realization, getting it on the ground, international cooperation, but also, of course, the storage side question. So it's kind of all three things have to fit together here. So and also we need a business case, and also public acceptance. So these are issues that have to be come together at the same time.
Tatiana, similar question to you. At the close here, any final thoughts or messages as to take us forward, particularly in regards to what we can expect next from the European Union on this front?
Well, I think it was already mentioned by another speaker. We continue working. I mentioned the industry alliance that we are forming with stakeholders on the carbon capture and storage. We have launched very recently also studies to see how the infrastructure in Europe for CO2 transport and storage will look like, and what kind of rules should govern it. So in the future, not in the next couple of years, but probably from the next mandate of the Commission, we could see some type of legislative proposals as to who has access to this network, and continuation of all the work that we are doing in financing, in funding, in particular within the Innovation Fund, and now also looking into the Connecting Europe facilities, so financing of infrastructure. And next year, we plan to give a little bit of shape to all these different elements into a communication, a Commission political communication, where we will explain how do we think that first to recognize that, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, that carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and use are essential technology to achieve decarbonization. I gave you some quantification numbers of how important it is for the CO2 emission targets, but one of the things we would like to look at more in detail next year is, revise those numbers and come up with updated modeling. We would like to look into, as I said, infrastructure. So what kind of legislation and ways that to solve the problems of infrastructure and access to infrastructure we could come up with. Then finally, the third topic, I think, as I mentioned, is to involve more and more the stakeholders, in particular industry, which is CO2 emitting, to buy in carbon capture and storage. whenever that makes sense for them, basically. So as I said, you have hydrogen as a possibility, you have carbon capture and storage, you have electrification for some industries, but you need to look into this array of different technologies and see what is best for you. And then from that, the EU and I think also the national authorities are keen to help.
Edward, I want to give you the opportunity to quickly close us out here. Your final thoughts on the outlook for CCS, both in Europe, but also I think within a transatlantic context.
Yeah, I think the outlook is quite positive. I think even though we're in the middle of an energy crisis at the moment, I try not to. I'm not here, I think, to lament too much over, I think, where Europe currently stands in the energy crisis. Rather, I think it presents itself an opportunity for greater collaboration. I think our response to the energy crisis so far has shown that without collaboration and cooperation, we won't be able to get through it. And I think that's how we should also face up to the climate challenge. I think we're very much looking forward to the Commission's continued work on the communication, and we're very much involved in their working groups, and we have been thus far, particularly ourselves and Bologna Europa as well. And I think also in Germany at the member state level is going to be very critical in terms of how this carbon management strategy is brought about. I think it's going to send important signals, certainly to the rest of Europe, and what we want to see is also greater action in member states. So we're going to be very much involved in the process. We're going to be trying to accelerate this as quickly as possible, and I think we not only look to Denmark as a shining example of how quickly we can work on this. Denmark started its carbon management came out with its carbon capture strategy just over a year ago, and now we're already seeing pilot injections taking place on its offshore storage site. It's going to yield up to 8 million tons a year of emissions reductions. So I think we have the potential to act very quickly. The only way we can do this is through a cooperation and collaboration, and I think we could. I think we definitely have the opportunity to accelerate our carbon capture deployment here.
Definitely. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have here this morning here in the United States. But there's certainly more to cover. And so be on the lookout for more work on this in this space. As Justus mentioned, it seems every single time we walk down a little bit of the CCUS value chain, we open up a whole nother box of interesting commercial and policy issues that are worth exploring. But for now, I'd like to thank our panelists once again for their really insightful remarks and for joining us this morning and taking the time. We look forward to hosting you again at Atlantic Council events in the near future. And I'd also like, before we close, to thank everyone who made this event possible, including Joe Webster, Alexander Del Vecchio, and Eamon Coughlin, as well as our friends over at CATF for the continued support of this work. Thank you as well to all of those who joined us virtually and asked and offered their questions and thoughts. We'll hope to see you soon at future Atlantic Council events. So until then, take care and we'll see you soon.
Thanks again.